Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.
Well, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. Tonight we have a really interesting topic for you. Typically on this program we go over historical or fact-based programs, and that's the way we usually like it. But tonight, and every once in a while, we like to get into a topic that is part historically based and part myth or fable. We're going to try to help you determine which is which tonight when we look at the Trojan War. The Trojan War is something that's always fascinated me all the way back to when I was a boy, when I heard about the Trojan Horse, and I heard about Helen of Troy and about the hero Achilles and Hector and all the famous people that came out of Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey. So we'll try tonight to really explain to you how to separate history from myth or legend when it comes to the Trojan War and when it comes to the famous poems that Homer put together. We're really going to get into where they found the remains of what they believe was the city of Troy, when they think it took place, as you see behind me, from 1194 BC to 1184 BC. They have historical record of that now. And so what they always thought was a myth coming out of these two poems, they've been able to more increasingly over the last several decades, is to verify that Troy did exist, that there was a very significant conflict that took place over those 10 years, that the city was destroyed and burned to the ground because of it. Also, they're unable to show a lot of the fictional aspects of what Homer was talking about in his stories. Many people believe were embellished over the centuries by people who were doing a play version of these poems, essentially doing the performances on stage to talk about the Trojan conflict. And as you can imagine, a lot of those performances embellished what actually happened in the real Trojan conflict. So we will get into all those details tonight, and we'll also watch a short video, and then we'll break those down for you so that we can really get into and help you understand what was true and what was legend or myth when it came to Troy. Let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so this is the Trojan War, separating historical facts from legendary fiction. You can see one of the great reenactments on the screen here of what they think a Trojan helmet used to look like back then, very similar to what Spartan helmets looked like, but they were a little bit more advanced than Spartan helmets in that they also had a front shield against both cheek that really helped to protect the soldier at that time. So as you can see, the date of this conflict is dated in history at 1194 BC to 1184 BC, a full 10-year conflict. And what's interesting is the myth is that that was battle that took place over Helen of Troy, but we will get into the aspects of that and what parts of that are myth. So looking at an overview of the Trojan War in history and in literature, and you can see this is a very ancient depiction they found in a tomb in Greece that shows back then what they were anticipating or depicting as the Trojan conflict that was taking place. So really interesting when you look back at the ancient art. It tells you a lot. Trojan War from 1194 to 1184, as we talked about, here's some great depictions of the battle themselves. There was another painting there on the top right that they found in one of the ancient Greek museums that shows one of the Greek tribes that was coming in to actually battle against the city. The Trojan War occurred around the late Bronze Age in the 12th century BCE, with the historian Eratosthenes placing it between 1194 and 1184 BCE, while the specific details of the war are legendary and recounted in epic poems like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Archaeological evidence suggests a real conflict took place, potentially at the site of Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey, which was destroyed by fire around the time. And most historians truly do believe that Hisarlik and the Turkey region was where Troy was at the time, and that it was very much a counterbalancing power to the Greeks. And the Greeks and the Trojans were battling over many centuries against each other. This particular conflict, of course, is when Troy was destroyed by the Greeks, who were coming to raid for many different reasons. So summary of the Iliad and major epic sources. The Iliad's focus, Homer's Iliad centers on the final weeks of the Trojan War, not the entire 10-year conflict. And it highlights heroism and conflict among warriors as the war and battle was coming to an end. Other epics and poems offer further insights from the time and even since, enriching the story and characters of the Trojan War. See another great picture there, what one of the top of the helmets would look like, all the ornate detail. So in terms of Homer's Iliad, it was a blend of history and fiction. It blended the city of Troy as a verified historical location, which we now have a dig that shows where it was, but it showed the Trojan War as depicted with divine intervention and legendary heroes that were largely fictional. While archaeological evidence supports a major destructive event at Troy, the story's specific details from the Trojan Horse to Helen of Troy are embellishments for narrative purposes and likely inspired by real events or phenomena rather than literal occurrences. So this is pretty generally accepted now that Troy did exist. There were multiple wars over the centuries, and that this big war that took place at the time we're talking did occur, and Troy was destroyed and burned to the ground. But that many of the fictional aspects of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey have not been verified, and most historians believe were not true. They were just embellishments by Homer to make the story more interesting. The poem is considered a work of art, not a historical document, though it may contain echoes of the Mycenaean era. You can see another great epic painting that they found in one of the Greek tombs, and then a depiction there of the Trojan horse as it was being pulled into the city. And then another great epic picture that was showing actually some of the battles and some of the conflicts that were happening between the Greeks and the Trojans. Homer's Odyssey, his other famous poem, was a work of myth, primarily fiction, but likely contains kernels of historical truth, particularly regarding the Trojan War and real-world locations in ancient Greece. The monstrous, fantastical elements like the Cyclops, magics, and giants are considered pure fiction, but other aspects of the story, such as its portrayal of Greek society and potential geographic settings, may reflect elements of real events in the historical Dark Age Greece during the Bronze Age. It's really interesting. You can still pull a lot of interesting supporting information for history out of these famous poems and these great stories that got embellished over the centuries. In terms of the poet Homer himself, there's a statue that was made to him that's actually in Athens even today. The history of the poet Homer is largely a mystery. He is credited author of epic poems like the Iliad and Odyssey, but little is known about his life, with scholars placing him between the 12th and the 8th centuries BC, and various ancient cities claiming him as their native son. It is probable that Homer was a prominent figure in an oral poetic tradition, possibly a wandering bard, and that the poems were composed and passed down through oral performances on stage before being written down centuries later. While some traditions depict him as blind, this is conjecture, and the poems themselves are the best insight into the life of the poet himself, whose identity remains a topic of debate and an enduring enigma. So you can see if he was an oral bard or a performer of some kind, he would pass these traditional stories down. They would get embellished and embellished further. They'd be performed on stage. And then, as you can imagine, the original story of the Trojan War ended up becoming a very fictional version of it. You can see a fantastic old relic there to the bottom right. That's one of the original copies of Homer's Odyssey that they located and they now have in another museum in Athens. So what a treasure that is to see the original Odyssey. So key characters and events in myth. So some of the central mythological figures that come out of the Iliad. You've got Achilles, who's part man, part god. Hector, who is the protector of Troy. Helen, who is the very famous, most beautiful woman of the time that they claim to have fought their war over. These were all characters who shaped the Trojan War's dramatic narrative and emotional depth. Events like the siege of Troy and Achilles' wrath highlight themes of conflict and honor and human struggle in mythology. And you can imagine that myths were so important back then that the Trojan War narrative would have gotten more and more important and more embellished over time. In terms of Achilles, the hero, he was a demigod warrior, and you can see a great depiction of him there to the left. He was born to a mortal king, Peleus, and the sea goddess Thetis. So he was half god, half human. His mother Thetis, who was the sea goddess, made him nearly invulnerable by dipping him in the river Styx, leaving only his heel exposed where she held his ankles with her fingers. So that's the great legend, as you can imagine. He only had one weakness, and that was his Achilles heel. Though prophesied to die young, he joined the Trojan War, where his pride led him to a quarrel with Agamemnon that caused a truce in his fighting and cost many Greek lives, including his friend Patroclus. Enraged by Patroclus's death, Achilles returned to the Battle of Troy, killed the Trojan champion Hector, who was defending the city, but then was killed himself by Paris's arrow striking his vulnerable Achilles' heel, the only place on his body where he could be given a fatal blow. So you can just see this type of character in Homer's Iliad would be such a legendary figure that he would get embellished and embellished over time. But he was truly the hero of the Trojan conflict. Achilles is actually played by Brad Pitt in the famous movie Troy. So Hector, who was the defender of Troy, was a legendary Trojan prince and one of the greatest warriors of the Trojan War. He was a hero of Homer's Iliad. He's remembered as a noble and courageous defender of his city, a role in which he fought to protect his family, his city, and people against invading Greek forces. After killing the Greek hero Patroclus, Hector was killed by Patroclus's close friend Achilles, who then desecrated his body. Hector's story is a tragic tale of heroism, duty, and a noble resistance against overwhelming odds. So you can see why Hector would also be a great hero in the pantheon of Greek myths. Helen of Troy. She was a figure from ancient Greek mythology, not history, primarily known for her legendary beauty and for causing the Trojan War by eloping with the Trojan prince Paris. While her myth is foundational to Greek culture and recounted in works like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the story lacks verifiable historical evidence of her existence at all. She was the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta, and her abduction by Paris of Troy violated the sacred laws of hospitality and led to a 10-year war between the Greeks and Trojans to retrieve her. So that's the legend, is that she was the main subject and reason for this war. And of course, that's a very simplified version of what was really true, which is that the Trojans and the Greeks were at each other's throats for many centuries, and that this 10-year period ended up being a Greek victory. But very interesting if you think about Helen of Troy and this legendary figure and how this incredible beauty that she had was something that two peoples were fighting over. So the Trojan horse itself, one of the most famous aspects of the Trojan War, is a myth, not a historical event. Though the Trojan War it describes likely had a basis in historical conflict and destruction of the city of Troy. While archaeological evidence confirms the city of Troy was burned, the wooden horse itself is considered a fable, possibly inspired by ancient siege engines or misinterpreted metaphor for a sea vessel used to deceive the Trojans. According to myth, after a long siege, the Greeks built a giant wooden horse and left it at the gates of Troy as an offering to the Greek goddess Athena. A Greek soldier named Sinon had pretended to desert the Greeks and go to the Trojans to fight. And he convinced the Trojans that the horse was a sacred gift and that bringing it inside the gates would ensure Troy's victory. The Trojans, believing the ruse, brought the horse inside their walls, only for Greek soldiers hiding within it to emerge that night, to open the city gates and to allow the waiting Greek army to come in and conquer Troy. So that's the legend, that this was trickery used by the Greeks to actually come within the city and end the siege. So this is the famous fable that all of us have always heard about the Trojan War, the Trojan Horse, which of course has become a symbol for trickery and for using deceptive practices. So what's the cultural significance of the Trojan War narrative? Trojan War narrative shaped ancient Greek cultural identity and inspired numerous works of art and literature. The story explores profound themes like honor and fate that resonated deeply in Greek philosophy and storytelling. The narrative highlights human desires and their consequences, providing moral and philosophical lessons out of the entire affair. In terms of the archaeological and historical evidence that has actually been found about Troy and the Trojan War, you can see one of the great digs that they found in the actual city itself. So excavations at Hisarlik and the search for Troy, and there's another great picture of that dig on the other side. Hisarlik is widely accepted as the location of ancient Troy, based on archaeological findings and historical correlations. Excavated since the 1870s, beginning with Henrik Schillmann, the site shows evidence of 9 different settlements built on top of each other, spanning from the early Bronze Age to the Roman period. So you can imagine this city was there for a long period of time with many different generations of people. Some city layers align with the era linked to the legendary Trojan War, suggesting a historical foundation. And what's really interesting is the layers that they dug up, they were from the early Bronze Age. They actually found lots of evidence of burning, buildings burning to the ground, lots of charred stone, lots of charred artifacts. And so it's really interesting that that one layer in particular looks like the city was actually burned to the ground, as the legend says. Historical records and their limitations. So Hittite texts mention conflicts in Anatolia, but do not provide direct evidence of the Trojan War. There's no definitive historical proof exists to confirm the occurrence of the Trojan War itself. Fragmented and incomplete records complicate efforts to reach confident historical conclusions. However, current historical thinking is that that period that was mentioned multiple times in multiple literatures back then did in fact happen during that 10-year period, that there was indeed a Trojan conflict between the Greeks and the Trojans, and that they were fighting over land and wealth and a number of other reasons. So they're pretty well convinced now, after many years of research and study, that the Trojan conflict actually did occur. Some more debates among historians and archaeologists. Some scholars argue Trojan War reflects actual Bronze Age conflicts with archaeological evidence supporting it. Others view the war as an allegory symbolizing broader Bronze Age events and societal struggles and battles between much larger societies. The war is also valued for its rich literary narrative and symbolic meaning beyond historical facts. So you can see there's still this debate going on even after many centuries of doing this research about whether the Trojan War occurred, and if it did, in what form. Legendary elements and literary enhancements. So in terms of the role of gods and supernatural intervention, gods actively intervened in different war scenes throughout the Homer Iliad and Odyssey and other literature talking about the Trojan conflict. The divine intervention symbolized ancient cultural beliefs and worldview about fate and human destiny. Supernatural actions add depth and complexity to the human stories and emotions in the Trojan War and complicate the actual history of the war. So you can see the people who are specialists in Greek history, Trojan history, and have been studying it for many, many years, have to parse between supernatural acts and what actually occurred. It makes it much more complex. But this generally was the intertwining of Greek philosophy, Greek cultural identity, and of course, Greek religious beliefs. Famous myths, the Trojan Horse and Achilles' heel, those two were the most important and lasting myths that came out of this period. The Trojan horse represents a clever strategy and deception used to win the Trojan War, and as I said before, has become an allegory or a way of explaining something that is a ruse or a deception for advantage. The Achilles heel symbolizes human weakness despite great strength and heroism. That essentially doesn't matter what kind of hero or how strong you are, you always have some kind of weakness that can be exploited by your enemy. In terms of poetic embellishments and storytelling techniques, repetition is one of the things the Greeks and Greek philosophers were best at. And they used it to reinforce key themes and help audiences remember epic narratives using oral storytelling. Oral storytelling back then was very important. And one of the biggest ways that traditions and stories got passed down from generation to generation, many times written many, many years later, in some cases, centuries later. Symbolism conveys deeper meanings and enriches the emotional depth of epic tales. And vivid imagery that was painted or put into some other kind of art gives mental pictures that captivate and engage listeners' imaginations. So as you can see, the Greeks were really great storytellers and passed it down through their literature, through their artifacts, and through sculptures and other paintings. So in terms of fact versus fiction of the Trojan era, some modern perspectives. Archaeological findings provide physical evidence to support or challenge elements of the Trojan War story. And as we said, there has been a lot found around Troy, in the dig itself, through the 9 different layers of rock that they've been digging in for many centuries. Scholars analyze ancient texts to interpret historical facts and distinguish them from fictionalized storytelling. So combining the archaeological digs and what they found there with the ancient texts often can piece things together. And finally, researchers have to acknowledge that many narrative details are likely mythological, while seeking what are the probable historical events that actually occurred. So that really is the mystery and the difficult part of this type of research. Influence of fiction on historical interpretation. Legendary stories of the Trojan War have influenced historical perspectives and educational narratives. Separating myth from historical fact is difficult when interpreting ancient narratives like the Trojan War. And as you can imagine, all throughout history, that's one of the things that those of us who are very interested about history and do historical research every day find the most difficult, is trying to separate what really happened and actually support it with evidence versus what is just legend that came out of a society at that time. And so it really makes it difficult and makes it interesting at the same time. It's kind of like a puzzle. So how the Trojan War continues to inspire arts and culture. The Trojan War influences epic poetry and novels, shaping timeless stories and characters in literature. The war's themes are dramatized in plays and performances, reflecting timeless human conflicts and emotions. And then modern films and artworks draw from Trojan War imagery and explore heroism, tragedy, and fate. So you can see this epic conflict, part of it historical and part of it legend, continues to inspire our art and our theater today. Some of the great books out there, if you want to read more about the Trojan War, fact versus fiction, you got a book there at the top by Barry Strauss, The Trojan War, In Search of the Trojan War and the Adventures of Odysseus, Empires of Bronze, The War That Killed Achilles, The Mysteries of the Trojan War, and then Trojan War, A Guide of Survival During the Trojan War. And these are all really excellent books, very well researched. Highly recommend if you want to get into it a little more, pick one of these books up and check it out. In terms of movies and TV shows, there's a lot of great ones out there. There was a Netflix series called Troy, Fall of the City. Helen of Troy was a really excellent production, very well done. I actually watched that about a year ago. The Trojan Horse, which was a movie created back in the 1960s. Very interesting to look at how they were producing movies back then. In Search of the Trojan War, you see down the bottom left there, that was a BBC series. And then Troy followed the city, just like in the top left. This is another picture of it from the Netflix BBC production. These are all really excellent ones to check out. Finally, the biggest blockbuster about the Trojan War with Brad Pitt, Eric Bana, and Orlando Bloom is called simply Troy. And it came out a number of years ago. Really excellent movie. If you like action, has a lot of action, a lot of battle scenes. Very well done, I thought. So check one of these movies and TV shows out, and you can get your knowledge up on the Trojan War in that period. Well, just wanted to take a moment to do a shout out to our sponsor for tonight's Traveling Through History episode, and that is Barnes & Noble. And just one of my favorite places to go, have one very close to my house. Go to it quite often. I like to go through there and just browse through all the great books and magazines. They have CDs, DVDs, everything you can imagine. They even have a little cafe in there. You can sit and drink your coffee or your hot chocolate. It's just a great time. And so definitely check out your local Barnes & Noble store or go to barnesandnoble.com and go check out a book and purchase something, or just have a great afternoon sitting in there and looking at all the great offerings that they have. So again, thank you so much, Barnes & Noble, for sponsoring us tonight. We'll see you next time. So hopefully you enjoyed that. You learned a lot about the Trojan War, fact versus fiction, about all the considerations on what is true, what was legend, what was myth. Let's go ahead and take a look at a quick video, and we'll come back and talk about it on the other side.
Very few pieces of literature have captured the Western imagination like the Homeric works, the Iliad and the Odyssey have. These works are what survives from a larger collection of poems called the epic cycle, or the Trojan cycle. These works describe the Trojan War, a war where the Greeks, also known as the Achaeans, go to war against the city of Troy in modern-day Turkey, after the prince of Troy, Paris, abducted Helen, the wife of the Spartan king. These works describe many influential stories, such as the death of Achilles, or Odysseus making his journey back home from the war. However, they ultimately culminate in Troy's fall to the Trojan Horse, a wooden horse secretly housing Greek soldiers, supposedly given to the Trojans as a peace offering by the Greeks. The soldiers would emerge from the horse and violently ransack the city. Troy would be destroyed, its royal family dead, and Helen rescued, with the Achaean heroes making their way back home to Greece. The story of the Trojan War has influenced the modern world in significant ways, with terms like Trojan Horse, Odyssey, Achilles' heel, and the word Trojan itself are now regularly used as common idioms and terms in everyday life. However, despite the cultural significance the Trojan War has had on Western civilization, there are many questions about whether the Trojan War, as presented in the works of Homer, even happened. Most scholars throughout history considered the Trojan War to be mainly fictitious. It wasn't until the 1870s, when Troy began to be excavated, that scholars began to reconsider. Now, the Trojan War is placed by scholars sometime in the 13th and 12th centuries, during the period known as the Late Bronze Age. So with these discoveries brought by knowledge gained in the past few centuries, can we find the real Trojan War and find out what really happened? This video will look at what the Homeric texts describe about the Trojan War, Troy's archaeology, and the historical context of the Bronze Age to try to find if we can answer this question. Despite the common idea and misconception, the Iliad and the Odyssey don't completely describe the Trojan War. Rather, they are part of a larger group of texts that describe the war in its entirety, called the epic cycle. This cycle of texts is composed of the Cypria, Iliad, Aethiopis, Little Iliad, Elopersis, Noistoi, Odyssey, and Telagene. Not all of these texts were written by Homer, just the Iliad and the Odyssey, but they were all written sometime between the 8th and 6th centuries, the general time of Homer. However, out of all the texts, the Iliad and the Odyssey are the only complete works. The rest are lost to history. We only know their content as they have either been quoted or summarized by later authors. So what do these texts describe? The Cypria primarily describes the origins of the conflict. It illustrates the dispute between many of the gods, which results in Paris, the crown prince of Troy, being chosen to resolve the conflict. His resolution is in favor of Aphrodite, who grants him the ability to marry Helen, the wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta. Paris then travels to the Greek mainland and either kidnaps Helen or manages to seduce her and get her to leave willingly. The circumstances of her and Paris' relationship are somewhat vague. Regardless, the result is the same, and the couple returns to Troy. Due to this, Sparta, along with other Greek states, went to war against Troy, with Menelaus' most powerful ally being Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae. The Greeks had numerous setbacks, and their invasion was delayed by a few years. They would eventually attack Troy, but the first attack would be repelled by the Trojans. The Iliad covers a very short time frame within the war, only about 50 days, but it does describe numerous battles and duels, notably between Achilles and Hector, and Paris and Milanus. The Iliad comes to an end not with the fall of Troy, but with the return of Hector's body after being defeated by Achilles. However, the Aethiopis resumes the story, and it describes battles engaged in by Achilles, including the one that kills him, via a shot to the heel. The Little Iliad describes the battles that occurred later, mainly those led by Odysseus. It also introduces the wooden horse filled with the Greek soldiers, the Trojan Horse. It ends with the horse being left outside the city gates and ominously taken in by the Trojans. The Iliopursis, also known as the Sack of Troy, ends this phase of the epic cycle and the Trojan War, with the Greek soldiers bursting from the wooden horse and the rest of the Greek army attacking the city, killing many of the city's inhabitants, including Paris. Helen would be regained by Milanus, and the city would be completely destroyed. The rest of the epic cycle describes the Greeks' return home and what happened after the war. At first glance, the Trojan War may appear to be completely fictitious with little historical backing. Gods descending and interfering with human affairs gives it a mythic ambiance akin to the story of Atlantis. In many aspects, the epic cycle and the Trojan War seem to be rooted in archaic Greek society, the time it was written in, and not 500 or so years prior during the Bronze Age. However, there are some Bronze Age elements within the narrative, but I will discuss that later. Before that can occur, we must first investigate what the archaeological record says about Troy. The Archaeology of Troy has a surprisingly long history. In the early 1800s, Scottish journalist Charles MacLaren first made suggestions that the mound of Hisarlik was the site of Troy. This was picked up by British consular Frank Calvert, who partnered with German millionaire Heinrich Schliemann to excavate the site. And they were right. The site of Hisarlik was the site of Troy. The site consists of 9 layers, which Schliemann numbered bottom up, with Troy 1 at the earliest to Troy 9 at the latest, going against the standard archaeological practice, which numbers layers top down. And recently in 2019, a new layer of Troy was discovered, now called Troy 0, that began around 3500 BCE. With so many Troys out there, which one was Homer's? Troy 1 succeeded Troy 0 and spanned from around 3000 to 2500 BCE. It was then destroyed in a fire before Troy 2 would arise, spanning to 2300 BCE. This level of Troy was one of the most grandiose out of all the levels and was one of the most prominent cities in the region during the time it existed. Troy 2 would be succeeded by Troy 3, which lasted from 2300 to 2200 BCE. Not much is known about Troy 4 and 5, as Schliemann destroyed many of these layers during his excavation, but these layers lasted around 500 years, from 2300-ish and 2200-ish to 1750 BCE. However, we do know about the following city, Troy 6. The transition between Troy 5 and Troy 6 was gradual. Troy 6 was established around 1750 BCE and was destroyed around 1300 BCE. The following city, Troy 7, can be divided into 2 distinct sublayers, 7A and 7B. Troy 7A was built immediately after the destruction of Troy 6, and was destroyed around 1180 BCE. Troy 6 and 7A are probably the most impressive out of all the layers, with both having strong citadels. Troy 7B was also inhabited from around 1180 to 1050 BCE, but was lower in population. Later in the period, Troy 7B was inhabited by a new population group, and Troy 7 would be abandoned towards the end of the 11th century, not to be inhabited for centuries. The most recent levels, Troy 8 and 9, don't belong to the Bronze Age, but rather the Hellenistic and Roman periods, when Troy was known as Ilion by the Greeks and Ilium by the Romans. Their placement during the late Bronze Age makes Troy 6 and 7A the prime candidates to be considered Homer's Troy, and most scholars consider it so. Though there are some issues with which city is Homer's Troy. One issue is how similar they are. Homer described that the city was completely annihilated by the Achaeans and left in ruin. However, while Troy 6 was destroyed, Troy 7 wasn't really a new city. It was the same city, just rebuilt by the Trojans, and they had an almost identical material culture, making it very unlikely Troy was invaded. It even appears that the Trojans were trading with the Greeks in Troy 7. Another issue is how exactly they were destroyed. The evidence from Troy 6 suggests it was destroyed by an earthquake, which Homer makes no mention of. However, there is another possible scenario that the city was destroyed in a popular uprising. Troy 6 and 7 was not the city itself, but rather the citadel residence of the royal family of Troy. There is evidence, such as the small presence of battle-like arrowheads, spearheads, and disfigured bodies. Suggesting a popular uprising is consistent with other records made during the 13th century. However, this idea is not accepted as much as the earthquake model is. Regardless, it still is not consistent with Homer's account. Troy VII, specifically Troy VIIa on the other hand, was destroyed in an attack around 1180 BCE. Based on this, it appears the evidence points to Troy VIIa being Homer's Troy. It was destroyed in an attack and another people group inhabited it soon after. Hold your horses though, because Troy VII cannot be Homer's Troy. Troy VIIa, for starters, wasn't nearly as impressive as Homer's description. Troy VIIa was poor, barely rebuilt city recovering from the earthquake. It was not extremely wealthy, with impressive fortifications, wide streets, and massive houses and palaces as Homer described. Troy VI, though, does fit the bill. Troy VI was wealthy, and did have impressive fortifications, wide streets, and grand houses like Homer describes. Greece developed a massive economy with complex industries, developed a bureaucratic structure, developed a writing system, Linear B, and became extremely wealthy as they constructed colossal palaces for their kings. This civilization has become known as the Mycenaean civilization, named after the city Mycenae, where the civilization was first discovered, which funnily enough was discovered by Schielman. The Mycenaeans' presence was widespread. Mycenaean pottery has been found throughout the Near East in places as far away as Crete, Cyprus, Canaan, and western Anatolia. While it is very unlikely for the Mycenaeans themselves to have been present in Cyprus and Canaan, the same cannot be said for Crete and even the eastern Aegean and western Anatolia. Crete was inhabited by Mycenaean settlers from as far back as when the Middle Minoan civilization fell, around the start of the Late Bronze Age, particularly at Knossos. As for western Anatolia, the Mycenaeans were extremely present in the region, particularly the area called the Lower Interface, an area including the coasts of western Anatolia and the Dodecines Islands, including Rhodes. During the Late Bronze Age, a vast amount of Mycenaean pottery and burials were uncovered in this area. It appears that the region underwent a process called Mycenaeanization. For the most part, this was not due to colonists, as some might think, but acculturation. Here, the locals gradually were brought into the Mycenaean culture, and a hybrid culture formed, where they mixed the customs. Although the Mycenaeans were certainly present, they were only merchants, but there is an exception, the famous city of Miletus. It is extremely likely that Miletus and the nearby city of Muskebi were inhabited by Mycenaean settlers. The archaeological evidence at Miletus suggests that the previous city at Miletus was destroyed and settled by Mycenaeans, but we can never know for certain. However, while it may appear as such, there is no evidence for a Mycenaean empire. Rather, Mycenaean Greece was made up of individual kingdoms and city-states. This is actually extremely similar to what is portrayed in Homer's works. Mycenae was the main center of the Mycenaean civilization, but other cities such as Thebes were also prominent. So was Troy a Mycenaean city? Was it a Hittite city? Or something else? To answer this, we have to keep in mind that Anatolia was not ethnically homogeneous. Sometime before 2300 BCE, Indo-European groups migrated into Anatolia. It is heavily debated how or when this happened, but sometime before 2300 BCE is the general consensus of scholarship. This migration, though, made Anatolia somewhat of an ethnic hodgepodge. The Hattians, not the Hittites, in central Anatolia were a native population that came into contact with the Indo-European Hittites, and the Hittites intermarried and assimilated the Hattians into the Hittite ethnicity. However, the Hittites weren't the only Indo-European group in Anatolia. The Luwians were also an Indo-European group that arrived around the same time, settling in western Anatolia. Their language was widely dispersed throughout Anatolia and was one of the more prominent languages. There were also the Palaeolians in the northwest, likewise of Indo-European origin. Recently, in September of 2023, while I was finishing up this script, a new language was discovered west of the Palaeolians, belonging to an area called Colosma. The inhabitants of Colosma were most likely Indo-European and could have been related to the Luwians. We ultimately will not know for sure until further research is published, so bear with me. There was also the non-Indo-European native Kaska people of the north who would cause regular trouble for the Hittites, pillaging the Hittite frontiers. And as mentioned previously, possible Mycenaean colonies were located on the coast, and other Mycenaean-influenced people were present in the Aegean. While we don't know for sure, Troy was most likely Luwian due to its placement in the region and the current archaeological evidence. However, even if it wasn't, it wouldn't matter much, as Troy's position would remain the same. Troy would be placed in the middle of two great forces trying to vie for power in the region. This would result in conflict, which is recorded in Hittite documents. Not only do these documents tell us what was occurring in the region, they even mention Troy. In Hittite texts found among the ruins of the Hittite capital Hattusa, Western Anatolia is mentioned extensively. In the works of Homer, the Greeks, or miraculously the Mycenaeans, were often called Achaeans, and most scholars agree that there is a linguistic connection between the terms Ahiawa and Achaean. This is not only due to similar names, but also due to the fact that in Hittite texts, Ahiawa was located somewhere outside of Anatolia, and Ahiawa also had control of Miletus, which was inhabited by Mycenaeans during this time. This indicates that Ahiawa was the Mycenaean Greeks. Ahiawa was likely not composed of the entirety of Greece. As I mentioned earlier, there was never a Mycenaean empire. Rather, the kingdom of Ahiawa was most likely the kingdom of Mycenae, with its core regions in the Peloponnese and holdings in the lower interface, including the Dodecines Islands and areas on the Anatolian mainland, such as Miletus. Due to their close proximity, Ahiawa and the Hittites would clash multiple times throughout their history. In Homer's works, Troy has two names actually, Troy and Ilios. And scholars have discovered that Ilios was originally called Wilios, but lost the Greek letter of the W sound over time. This makes it almost certain the Wilusa in Hittite text is Troy. Not only that, but Paris, the prince of Troy who stole Helen from the Greeks, was also named Alexander. You don't have to be a scholar to see how similar the name Alexandru is to Alexander, and come to the conclusion that Alexandru was the Hittite name for Alexander. Furthermore, these events took place in the general time period and frame of the Trojan War. So does this mean we have the historical Trojan War? To cap it off, we have a conflict in Troy occurring around the time of the Trojan War. We have the players, with the Mycenaeans heavily involved in the region. We have a ruler with the same name as a character in Homer's works, and we have a situation between the Hittites and the Mycenaeans that would lead only to more conflict. Yet there are some difficulties. As mentioned before, Troy was destroyed twice, and the Mycenaeans destroyed neither of them. One was by an earthquake, and another was by a group of unknown attackers, most likely the Sea Peoples, who ravaged the Near East and destroyed many sites in the late 12th century. Furthermore, there's too little information on Troy during the Bronze Age to be able to come to a conclusion about what the real Trojan War was. The letters and the sources we do have can be interpreted in wildly different ways. Troy could have been attacked by the Mycenaeans, but there's no real evidence that occurred, and Troy could not have been attacked at all. All of our sources are highly fragmentary, and thus they don't give us the whole picture. There's no evidence of a single massive campaign against any Anatolian power by the Mycenaeans. Rather, it appears to be small conflicts and skirmishes with the Mycenaeans occupying some areas on rare occasions. The military conflict described by Homer fits the archaic world rather than the Bronze Age, which makes sense given that is the time period Homer lived in. I'm not trying to say there isn't any Bronze Age elements to the story, there certainly are. Some scholars like Eric H. Klein have pointed out that Homer's story of the Trojan War could have used many sources to draw upon through oral tradition. He could have used the stories and traditions stemming from Arzawa and the Hittite conflicts, also possibly the stories of Ahiwa and their conflicts with the Hittites, or even Alexandru and his successors' reigns, or maybe even some traditions stemming from events we aren't even aware of. Homer could have also possibly used the wealth and grandeur of Troy VI and the nature of the destruction of Troy VIIa and fused the two cities together in his narrative. Not to mention, he could have fused older epics with his own. However, we should take these facts more as kernels of history and historic memory rather than an accurate depiction of what actually happened. We have to remember two things. 1. Homer lived 500 years after the event took place. 2. Homer was not a historian, but rather a poet. His end goal was not to write history, but to tell a story. He likely did not really care how historically accurate his epic was. He simply tried to tell his epic, not for history's sake, but for storytelling's sake. This, I think, is a principle we need to keep in mind. Many people hold these ancient stories near and dear. Heinrich Schliemann did, and that is the whole reason he excavated Troy, to prove that the story of the Trojan War was correct. Ancient authors did not have a concept of history like we do. They mainly made texts for different ideological reasons, whether it be political, theological, or national reasons. We have to keep this in mind dealing with any text, whether it be Greek, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, or even the biblical text. Ultimately, being honest with the text and trying to read between the lines to discover what the author's true intentions were and what the actual historicity behind the text is a lot more insightful than taking these texts at face value, and that applies to all of them.
So you can see there's a lot to unpack there. You can imagine how complicated it has been over the centuries, and especially the last 80 years, to excavate, to dig, to understand what is true, what is fiction versus the Trojan narrative, which groups were coming to Troy and destroying. Obviously, it's much more complicated than just the Greeks versus the Trojans. There were many different groups that were in that area and could have a reason to try to destroy Troy, try to raid Troy. You mentioned the Hittites and many others. You also saw the excavation of Troy has uncovered first 9 layers and recently a 10th layer, which they're calling Troy VIIa, back to 3500 BC. And so it's a very complicated but very interesting situation as we continue to uncover what is history and what is legend. And so hopefully you enjoyed and learned a lot about the Trojan War, about the Trojan period, the Bronze Age, Trojans in general, and what was happening in the area at the time with the Greeks on one side, the Hittites on the other. And we'll continue to do this research. We'll continue to study it and look at it. And hopefully you're going to want to dig into it as well and learn a lot more about this very fascinating period of history and what was true and what was legend. And we really want to uncover that for you. Hopefully you enjoyed this video tonight, and you'll join us for another episode of Traveling Through History very soon. Please like the video and subscribe to this channel. Drop us a comment on another topic you'd like us to cover. And hopefully you love history as much as we do. We'll see you next time.
Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.